Hello everyone, it's Mark. I am your host here at the first chapter. Today I will be reading the prologue and first chapter of In the Shadow of Lightning by Brian McClellan. In the Shadow of Lightning is Brian's new epic fantasy novel, book 1 in the Glass Immortals series. It is out from Tor Books today, June 21st, 2022, and the timestamp is on screen if you would like to just go ahead and jump ahead to the reading. I have known Brian for many years. He is the author of the two Powder Mage trilogies as well as the Valkyrie Collections novellas. His previous books, the two Powder Mage trilogies, were from Orbit, and this is his first book with Tor. He did have one novella with Tor.com as well, but this one is a full epic fantasy. This book is in a completely new series, not related to any of those universes, and it will be a large epic fantasy series, The Glass Immortals, and I am very excited for book 2 whenever that comes out, but before then, we really should look at a preview of book 1. As a disclaimer, I was a beta reader for this book. I have read the entire thing and absolutely loved it. In addition, I received an advanced reader copy of the book, so I have 2 copies, but I will be reading from the final copy today. And the dust jacket blurb says, "Magic is a finite resource, and now it's running out." In this brilliant new epic fantasy from bestseller Brian McClellan. Demir Grappo was an outcast. He fled a life of wealth and power, abandoning his responsibilities as a general, a governor, and a son, destined to live out his days as a grifter, rootless and alone. But when his mother is brutally murdered, Demir must return from exile to claim his seat at the head of the family and uncover the truth that got her killed. The very power that keeps civilization turning, Godglass, is running out. Now, Demir must find allies, old friends and rivals alike, confront the powerful guild families who are only interested in making the most of the scraps left at the table, and uncover the invisible hand that threatens the empire. A war is coming, a war unlike any other, and Demir and his ragtag group of outcasts are the only thing that stands in the way of the end of life as the world knows it. And before we get started, one more caveat. My AC is out right now, so I am going to be a little sweaty, so please pardon me today if I am a little shiny. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. And at the beginning of the book, we see here some really awesome art and descriptions of the various types of glass and what they do. And we also see some really, really neat detailed maps. These maps and this art is all done by Ben McSweeney, who is absolutely awesome. And then we get into the book. The chapters have icons for the various different types of glass, also by Ben McSweeney. And so, here we go. Prologue. Demir Grappo picked his way through the aftermath of a battle as the sun began to set over the mountains. The sky was a brilliant hue of red, wispy clouds looking like the flames of an eternal forge. A scene worthy of a painting, if not for the carnage spread out across the plain in every direction. Demir let his eyes linger on that sunset, trying to block out the screams and moans of the dying. He wondered if his army had an official artist. Most armies did, didn't they? If not, he should get one. He held up his fingers to make a rectangle like that of a landscape painting. It was an incredible view. Slowly, he lowered his fingers so that they took in the rapidly darkening battlefield. This, less so. Demir had grown up on stories of wartime glory, of heroism and last stands and outnumbered cavalry charges, of unstoppable breachers in their brightly colored sorceress armor, cutting a swath through infantry while glass dancers rained shards of glittering silica across the battlefield. Those painted words had always been so much cleaner than reality. They hadn't talked about the clouds of powder smoke, or the putrid slurry of mud and blood underfoot. None of his tutors had ever mentioned the screams of grown men and women, weeping for fear, for wounds, or for their dead friends. They certainly hadn't mentioned the smell. And the blood. Oh, so much blood. There always was when glass dancers were involved. Demir had managed 3 victories in 7 days, and he could not deny that watching a battle unfold to his specifications had made his heart pound in a way he'd never before experienced. Seeing the enemy routed, listening to his soldiers cheer, those things certainly felt glorious. But thus, there was no glory for the medics, surgeons, and priests wandering the aftermath. Demir contemplated the swampy morass of blood left in the wake of a company of soldiers who'd fallen beneath a glass dancer's attack. The bodies were eviscerated, sliced apart by millions of shards of glass. Those that survived looked like horror house dummies, screaming in agony until a medic could reach them with various types of god glass to distract the mind, lessen the pain, and speed recovery. Was that his handiwork, he wondered? They were rebel soldiers, after all, and it was easy to lose track of these sorts of things during the chaos of a battle. His eyes fell on one of the wounded, a young woman sitting up with precious, pain-deadening milk glass clenched between her teeth. She was staring at Demir with a mixture of horror and fear so intense that Demir found himself covering the overlapping triangle tattoo on his left hand that marked his sorcery. His glass dancer tutor had once told him that it was good and right for their kind to stand above others. It was a gift, she had claimed, and beyond the sorcerer's power to manipulate common glass, it would also give him a psychological edge over others. They would always fear him because they knew he could kill with a thought. The evidence was before him. Hundreds of men and women cut to ribbons. They were right to fear him. He had never witnessed his own destructive power with such acuity as he had on the battlefield these last 7 days. And deep down, it terrified him. Would he get used to this over time? He was only 20 years old, after all, and this was his first campaign. Would he harden, or would it always leave him sickened? Demir looked around for something, anything, with which to ground himself. His staff of officers hadn't yet noticed his disappearance, and he was alone but for the dead, the wounded, and the healers and priests, who tended to both. The living gave him a wide berth the moment they connected his decorated black uniform with the Silic sigil marking him as a glass dancer. They might not actually recognize him, but they could do the math. General Grappo, the glass dancer commander. He hated that so much. Why couldn't they see the victories he'd given them, instead of the deadly sorcery he never wanted? His eyes finally fell on a familiar figure, and he turned his aimless wandering in that direction. He passed a medic, handing a piece of white god glass the size and shape of a horseshoe nail to a wounded soldier. Clutch it between your teeth until the pain passes, the medic instructed, glancing at Demir as if it were his doing. Half the soldier's guts were hanging out. She would be dead in a few hours, but the sorcery of the milk glass would ease her passing. On a whim, Demir tried to feel the little piece of milk glass with his sorcery, but the spot it occupied was cold and dead to his senses. God glass was the only glass a glass dancer could not manipulate. Putting the medic and his dying patient from his mind, Demir approached the man he'd seen kneeling in a small clearing in the field of the dead. Demir knew him just well enough to guess that he was not praying. Clearing his head, he called it, before and after every battle. Demir wished more soldiers attended to their own minds as carefully. Adrian Sepulchy was big, over 6 feet tall, with skin as dark as coal, broad shoulders, and legs as strong as tree trunks. He wore the armor of a breacher, half plate of interlocking steel, worked with a myriad of high-resonance god glass. accents of milk glass to suppress pain, bands of yellow forge glass to increase his strength and speed, pinpricks of purple wit glass to invigorate the mind. Most predominant of all was the dark blue hammer glass that was harder than steel, making the armor itself almost indestructible. Adrian's kite shield and immense bastard sword, both also inlaid with god glass, lay on the ground beside him, crusted in blood from the battle. His helmet had two hammer-glass ram's horns curled tightly against the steel. Among the soldiers, Adrian was known simply as the Ram. The sorcery of so much god glass in one place would sicken a normal person in a few minutes and kill them in mere hours. But Adrian was a glazelier, one of those rare individuals resistant to glass rot. All breachers were, by necessity. Demir glanced down at the back of his own hand, where a purple, scaly shimmer had appeared on his skin. It was the first sign of glass rot, caused by using wet glass to plan and command the battle. Without care, the patch would harden into something akin to fish scales and become permanently fixed to his skin. He would need to be judicious with his exposure to sorcery for a few days. Adrian Sepulchy, Demir greeted Adrian. The soldier cracked open one eye, saw that it was Demir, and made to get to his feet. Demir stopped him with a wave. Don't let me interrupt. There is nothing to interrupt, sir, Adrian replied, his voice a deep, vibrant bass. I am simply emptying my mind of violence. He opened both his eyes, revealing that the right had been replaced long ago with a false eye made of purple wit glass. Demir had asked around a couple weeks ago, but no one seemed to know where he'd gotten that glass eye, or why it hadn't killed him yet. Taking god glass into one's own body wasn't unheard of, but it was very dangerous, even to a glazelier. Sounds healthy, Demir responded. I was enjoying the sunset myself. Adrian fixed Demir with that unsettling, one purple-eyed gaze. There was no fear in that gaze, and for that Demir was grateful. At least someone in this army viewed him as more than a monster. But then again, breachers were little more than state-sponsored killing machines. Power understood power. It is quite striking, sir. Congratulations on the victory. Demir gave Adrian a cool nod and wondered if it irked the breacher to call someone less than half his age sir. It does seem to be a victory, doesn't it? The enemy has been crushed. Whatever strength they have left has fled to the mountains. Holican lies defenseless before us. Adrian nodded to himself. At least, that is the intelligence I have received. You may have more current information. No, that's about the sum of it. Adrian snorted. Thank you, sir. Do you happen to know where my battalion is? Demir considered this for a moment, going through a catalogue of the thousands of commands he'd sent over the last 24 hours. He wouldn't usually keep tabs on a single battalion, but Adrian belonged to the Ironhorn Rams. They were commanded by Demir's uncle Thaddeus, and they were the best combat engineers in the Asen Empire. Adrian would normally be with them, but Demir's plans for this battle had required an extra breacher. Haven't caught up to us yet, he answered. I imagine they're still blowing up bridges around the Tien. He frowned. That reminds me. Let's send a fast horse to let them know the war has been won. No need to destroy infrastructure that doesn't need to be destroyed. Of course, sir. Should I carry the message myself? Eager to join back up with them? They're my friends, sir. I don't like them being without their breacher. Ah, no, stay with me a while yet, at least until I'm completely certain of the enemy's surrender. We'll send a horse, and I'll make sure you rejoin them soon. Thank you, sir. He paused. If I may? Yes? The soldiers are calling you the Lightning Prince. I thought you might want to know. I hadn't heard that. Demir took the name on his tongue and rolled it around. Is it meant to be diminutive for my age, or a celebration for the speed of my campaign? Adrian hesitated just a moment too long. Come now, be honest. Both, I think. Demir chuckled. I like it. The Lightning Prince. Most great men were middle-aged before they'd earned an honorific like that. He hummed to himself, enjoying the way the nickname sounded in his head. It almost made him forget the blood soaking his boots. Maybe he would get used to this. Maybe he would harden to killing and to ordering others to kill. He shuddered. No. More importantly than being a glass dancer or a general, he was a politician. He was in charge of this campaign by circumstance only, and within a few days he planned on heading right back to his province, where he could put the bloodshed behind him and focus on helping his people. Adrian climbed to his feet, towering over Demir by 8 inches. Sir, I believe that your staff is looking for you. Demir glanced the way Adrian nodded to see a small group approaching on horseback. They were an odd mix of Austen political liaisons, here to oversee negotiations with the enemy, and grizzled officers sent along to make sure this young upstart governor didn't make a complete disaster of his first campaign. The lot of them grinned at him like asylum fools. He could see in their eyes that they expected to gain prestige, lands, and merits on the coattails of his victory. Demir didn't mind. Sharing credit meant they would be beholden to him in the future, a card to keep in reserve, for if he ever needed it. He let his eyes wander across the group for several moments, making mental notes of who he could use in the future, who might be trouble, and who he could forget. Tavrish Magna was a great pot-bellied jokester with few ambitions. Helena Dorlani whispered behind Demir's back, constantly, undermining him with the subtlety of a company of cuirassiers. Her cousin, Gevry, gladly took Demir's bribes to report on her. 3 members of the small Forleo guild family had managed to finagle their way onto his staff, and they stood to gain the most from this campaign, while Jacob Stavry had made deals in the assembly that bet strongly against Demir's success. He would lose hundreds of thousands, and based on the look on his face, he knew it. It was a complex group, both personally and politically, untrustworthy adders slithering around his feet, any one of which might bite at any time. Even in victory, he needed to be cautious, lest one of them turn on him for their own gain. The man out front was named Capric Vorsian, and he was a personal friend that Demir had brought on campaign to cover his back against all the rest. Capric was a tall, thin man in his early 20s, with the black hair and olive skin of an Austen native. Tattooed on his right hand was an inverted triangle crossed with the wavy lines of a sun setting over the desert, the Silic symbol of the Vorsian guild family. He saluted Demir grandly and swung down from his horse. "Hail, victorious Grappo!" Capric called. The others echoed the words with various levels of enthusiasm. Demir gazed back at the group, still evaluating each person, noting the secrets hidden in the eyes of each. Behind their pleasure at a battle won, there was fear there, just like the soldiers. How many glass dancers were there in the officer corps, after all? Not many. Capric was the only one who didn't seem to walk on eggshells. "That was an incredible battle," he complimented Demir. "Satisfactory," Demir demurred. "That countercharge from the dragoons surprised me." "But you shattered it anyway. Glass damn you, man, take some credit!" Capric clasped his hand, pulling him into a congratulatory hug, during which he whispered, "Look over my left shoulder. If you want to go ahead with your next plan, now is the time." Demir's eyes found an unfamiliar trio among his staff. A middle-aged woman with the blonde hair of an Eastern provincial, accompanied by 2 bodyguards, all 3 of them looking haggard and defeated. He pulled back from Capric and gestured at the group. "Who is this?" he asked loudly, though he knew exactly who they were. "The mayor of Holican has come to surrender." At Capric's gesture, the woman approached Demir, hands held out in supplication. She fell on her knees, pressing her face to the ground. "I surrender the city of Holican," she intoned. "I do not ask for terms, but I offer my life in exchange for the lives of my subjects. They do not deserve the wrath of the Empire." Demir blinked down at her. He had discussed this moment with Caprick at length. It was the crux of the next step in his political career, and yet it still managed to surprise him. Beside the prostrating mayor, Helena d'Orlani produced a short silver lance and now held it, pommel first, toward Demir. Tradition dictated that he accept the surrender and then pierce the mayor's neck with the ceremonial weapon, executing her on the spot. She was a rebel, after all, an insurrectionist and traitor to the Ossan Empire. Demir glanced toward Adrian, his confidence wavering at the idea of such immediate, formalized bloodshed. But the breacher had taken 2 long steps back, as if to say that a soldier had no business in that kind of thing. Demir took the lance from the liaison and turned toward Caprick. Caprick himself just shrugged. He knew Demir's mind. He knew Demir had no intention of following outdated traditions just to please the assembly. Demir gave the lance a little twirl and then slapped the haft thoughtfully against his left palm. "Stand up," he said. The mayor glanced at Demir, then up at the gathered officers. She seemed confused by the fact that she wasn't being speared at this moment. Demir thrust the lance into the ground, the point first, then leaned on it, while he took the mayor under one arm and pulled her to her feet. He offered her his hand. "Good evening. I'm Demir Grappo." The mayor stared at his other hand for several moments, or, rather, at the glass dancer sigil on it. Finally, she answered the handshake. "I am Myria Forel, mayor of Holican." She hesitated for another few moments, then added, "I've heard of you, Demir Grappo." "Good things, I hope." She nodded. "What are you doing here? You're a governor 2 provinces over, a politician, not a warrior." "Warrior?" Demir laughed and jerked his thumb at Adrian. "He's a warrior. I'm just a bit clever. Tell me, Myria, what do you want?" Excuse me? 7 months ago, you declared your independence from the Ossan Empire. You've defeated 2 armies, gathered support from your province, and from what I can tell, you were doing a damned good job of this whole rebellion before I showed up. And yet, you're still calling yourself a mayor. "Because that's what I am," she said incredulously. "So this wasn't a personal power grab? You haven't made yourself monarch of Holican?" "No," she said emphatically. "I declared independence because Ossa has only ever treated us as provincials. We are not, and never will be, equals. We want fair taxes, and local magistrates, and—" Demir cut her off gently. "I know. I read your declarations, all 87 of them. I just wanted to ask you in person." A throat cleared, and Demir turned to find that Helena d'Orlani had retrieved the silver lance, wiped the blade, and now held it toward him once again. "General Grappo, it is tradition that you spill the blood of the rebel leader, then decimate the city." She seemed confused, her eyes darting toward the sigil on Demir's left hand, as if wondering why a glass dancer wasn't ready to kill at a moment's notice. Demir ignored her and took a long look toward the city, where lanterns were being lit in the windows as night fell. He could imagine the fear of all those people, having just witnessed their armies scattered, knowing the traditions of the Ossan Empire. "Decimate," Demir muttered, "to force the entire city to draw lots, and then make them murder 1 out of every 10 of their own number. No quarter for the children or the infirm. That sounds unpleasant." "It's meant to be," Helena insisted. "It's a punishment." "For what? The crime of wanting to be treated as citizens in their own country?" Demir snorted. "I don't believe the punishment fits the crime, and I will not allow it." "But," Helena stuttered, "you must." She turned to Caprick. "Tell him that he must follow tradition." Demir didn't let his friend answer for him. "What law requires it?" he asked lightly. "None. I may be young, but I was the governor of my own province when I was 14. There is a difference between law and tradition, and I know the laws like my own Silic symbol." He held up his right hand to show the tattoo of an upside-down triangle with cracked lightning spreading from the center. It was the sigil of the Grappo Guild family, a complement to the glass dancer sigil on his left, the 2 tattoos of true power within the empire. He took a deep breath. "Madame Mayor, do you surrender Holican into the care of Demir Grappo of the Ossan Empire?" Myria Forel stared at him warily. "I do." Wonderful. As the words were said, Caprick was already removing something from his saddlebags. He produced and unfurled a black crimson cloak with solemnity. Demir felt the twinge of a smile on his lips, his heart skipping a beat. The victor's cloak was another tradition, one of pomp and foolery meant for nothing but flattery. But he damn well earned it, and he savored the moments that it took Caprick to lay the heavy fabric across his shoulders and then clasp the golden chain. Caprick finished the ceremony by placing a single kiss on Demir's left cheek and giving him a small bow. Well done, Lightning Prince. The hairs on the back of Demir's neck stood on end at the formal statement of his new honorific. He kept his face expressionless, nodding to Caprick and then declaring, "The city of Holocan is now under my protection. They are not rebels, they are our cousins, and we will treat them accordingly." The officers stared back at him in vague surprise. None of them would argue, of course, not with their general, and certainly not with a glass dancer, but he knew they were all furiously pinning letters to the capital in the back of their heads. "What the piss are you doing?" Maria whispered. He replied in a low voice, "I may be an awesome citizen, but I'm also the governor of a province. My people have the same complaints as yours, and I will take them to the assembly. They won't be happy. The assembly is made up of a bunch of rich, self-fellating fools. I know because I am one. We're never happy. You're mad to defy them." Madness and greatness are separated only by the degree of success. Besides, Demir glanced at the battlefield around him. His stomach turned at the sight, and he found himself struck with a longing to return to his province. This last week had proved he was good at war, but he much preferred peaceful administration, where he could spend all day greasing the cogs of government and then climb into bed with his mistress. He thought briefly about how most citizens his age were busy going to university, getting laid, and looking for the next drink. He wondered what it would be like to be idle for once. The option had never been given to him. "I find that I prefer the living to the dead, and having friends to making enemies." Demir glanced over his shoulder to find that Adrian was still there, the big breacher wearing a thoughtful expression, gazing past Demir's head and into the distance. He rubbed at his god-glass eye. Demir wondered if he disapproved. Perhaps he would ask him on another day. "Adrian Sepulchy," Demir said, "I'm placing the mayor under your protection. Keep her safe until we can sort out the rest of this mess, Adrian nodded silently. "Good." Demir slipped one hand into a special cork-lined pocket in his uniform. He produced an inch-long, spoon-shaped piece of wood glass. The handle end of the spoon was worked into a flared hook that he pushed through one of the piercings on his right earlobe. Wit glass was fairly common. It augmented natural mental faculties, making it a favorite among shopkeepers, officers, politicians, and more. But high-resonance wit glass, the very best quality, had a habit of driving its wearers mad. Demir was the only person he knew of with a strong enough mind to make use of it. The sorcery took effect immediately, the barely perceptible hum and vibration creeping into his brain to speed his mind, allowing him to visualize the branching possibilities of the near future. He made calculations at an inhuman speed, processing decisions weeks ahead of time, preparing himself for his next 100 moves, as if he were playing a complicated game. But this wasn't a game. It was his career, and the lives of all these people, and perhaps even the future of the Empire. He would use his victory to bolster his guild family name the same as any good Austin, but he would also use it to better the lives of millions. Ambitions, he had decided when he was barely 12, did not have to be just for oneself. He had ambitions for everyone. One day, the world would see that he was more than his innate sorcery. The masses would smile at him without fear. Satisfied with his plans and remembering his own encroaching glass rot, he slid the wit glass off his ear and back into his pocket, where the velvet and cork lining protected him from the god-glass sorcery when he didn't need it. He let his fingers remain there for a moment, running them over the various god-glass bottles. Each was shaped differently, so as to be picked out by feel, a comforting assortment of sorcerous crutches for his weak mortal body. He was deep in thought from his brief meditation when one of the staff, still on horseback, called out, "Sir, there's something going on back in camp." Demir felt the tug of his own thoughts, and it took a force of will to pull himself out of them. He let go of Maria's arm, giving it one last reassuring pat, as if they were old friends, before lifting his eyes in the direction of the camp. The plain here had only a slight incline, and it wasn't until he had found his horse and gotten onto the saddle that he was able to see what the staffer had been talking about. There was, indeed, something going on in camp. Hundreds, no, thousands of torches had been lit, and a large procession was breaking away from the encampment and heading across the plain directly towards Holican. The torches glittered as the last vestiges of sunlight disappeared over the horizon. Despite all of his mental faculties, Demir found himself completely flummoxed. After the battle, select regiments had been sent out to treat the wounded, hunt the fleeing enemy, and secure outposts, but the bulk of the soldiers had been ordered to return to their tents, where casualties could be counted and control could be asserted over an army with their blood up. So what the piss were they doing marching toward the city? "Caprick," he called out, "find out what's going on over there." Caprick scowled in the direction of the city for a few moments before throwing himself into the saddle. Demir watched him ride away, transfixed, something in his brain refusing to click over, knowing that something was wrong but unable to find an explanation. This was not in his calculations. Unwilling to show himself in a panic, but unable to remain completely idle, Demir began to ride slowly toward the south, a fear of the unknown growing in his belly. He took the fabric of his victor's cloak between two fingers of his left hand, rubbing it anxiously. It wasn't until Caprick returned, breathless, that the fear really took hold. "Demir," Caprick barked, "there's been some kind of communication error. The 8th seems to think they have orders to sack the city." "Sack the..." Demir whispered. "What glass-damn century is this? We don't sack cities. Get back there and tell them to return to camp. Spread the order to all the colonels. Go!" Caprick galloped off, and Demir glanced over his shoulder at his staff. He eyeballed Helena Dorlani first, then Jacob Stavrian, the oldest of the Forleo brothers. Everyone wore the same expression of vague confusion and surprise that he imagined on his own face. "Who gave orders to sack the city?" They all looked at each other and shook their heads. "No one would give an order like that," Jacob said. "Decimation, yes, but nobody has sacked a city in 100 years. Demir swore and turned back, watching until the realization finally settled in that the soldiers would reach the outskirts of the city before Caprick even made it back. Once they'd actually started their pillaging, it would be impossible to get them to stop. He dug in his own heels, forcing his horse into a gallop, barely hearing the startled swearing of his staff. The darkness quickly forced him to rein in lest his mount break a leg, crossing the uneven plain, and it was almost 10 minutes before he reached the column. He was greeted by a harried Caprick. "The colonels say they all have orders to sack the city," Caprick reported. "Who gave the order?" Caprick winced. "You did." "What?" "They all have orders with your personal seal telling them to conduct the sacking." No, Demir breathed, watching the stream of soldiers flow past him, torches and bayoneted muskets in hand. Some were somber. Some cheered the dark promise of a night spent slaking a bloody thirst. All of them were heading out to follow orders. His orders, apparently. He fumbled for his whip-glass, fixing it to his ear, long enough to churn through his memories, looking for some kind of mistake. Had he sent out a poorly worded missive? Had he said something offhand to one of his secretaries? Nothing immediately came to mind, and that terrified him. Mistakes could be made along the best lines of communication, but this was beyond anything he'd encountered in his studies. He needed to find out what had happened, but first he had to curtail this impending ruin. He pointed to an officer among the group. "You there, Captain, hold your men!" The captain either didn't hear him or ignored him. The soldiers themselves were so engrossed in the prospects of their new mission that they didn't even notice his presence. Demir urged his horse closer, wishing he had a pistol to fire in the air. "Stop!" he shouted. "Hold! Get yourselves in order, damn it!" Anger warred with the growing panic in himself. He reached out, grasping for the scattered bits of glass left over from the battle and plucking them up with his mind. Hundreds of shards rose into the air, hovering in place like frozen raindrops as they awaited his mental command. His eye twitched. His thoughts stayed by indecision. Could he kill his own men to avert this disaster? How many would he need to massacre to get their attention? After several moments, he let go. The pieces fell, sprinkling to the ground, unnoticed by the marching soldiers. He heard a gunshot, then another. Screams came from the direction of the city, followed by the sounds of whooping. Demir could feel control slipping from his fingers, eliciting a panic deep in his chest, like one he'd never felt in his life. He turned and galloped toward the outskirts of the city, where gunshots, screams, and shouting grew louder and more chaotic. He soon passed a woman's body laying by the wayside, bayoneted several times. The sight of it made him want to vomit. He saw another corpse, then another. Obvious civilians, all of them. A stronger man, a more experienced glass dancer, would have ended this with a quick, brutal show of discipline. Demir knew he could still do it, but he couldn't bring himself to take the action. His mind was spinning now, frayed at the edges and threatening to snap. What madness was this? How could any of his officers have thought he would give such an order? He had marched them across the mountains with uncanny speed and won them 3 great victories, but he'd never been cruel in triumph. He reached the outskirts of the city and found that thousands of his soldiers had already plunged into the interior. They rushed from building to building, snatching anything of value, throwing children into the street, killing men and women where they stood, all in the flickering torchlight, while the smoke of burning buildings began to thicken. Demir continued to ride, searching for officers, trying to find someone to help him get this under control. He was half blinded by smoke, confused and disoriented, when his horse stumbled over a tipped cart. He barely threw himself free of the animal, landing on his left hand, pain lancing up his arm. His horse rolled over, making a murderous racket, then got upright and galloped off into the night. Clutching his wrist, unable to think through the pain and the cacophony, Demir rushed from building to building, ordering his soldiers to stop. He berated them, lambasted them, and finally begged them. A few of them frowned at his mud-covered uniform. No one recognized him. Why would they? Few had ever seen his face up close, and he couldn't get the glove off his broken left hand to show them his glass dancer's sigil. Who is this? One would ask. Some madman, another would say. He has an officer's uniform and an expensive cloak. The officers are all getting drunk in Grappo's tents. We have orders to follow. If we don't do it quick, someone else will get the good loot. 3 cheers for the Lightning Prince. They would laugh and ignore him. Someone finally grabbed him by his victory cloak and threw him into a ditch, where he barely caught himself before going face down in the filth. He lay partially submerged in the muddy, shit-filled water, staring into the street. His whole body shook with fury and terror. Not half an hour ago he had pledged that Holican was under his protection. And now there were orders under his seal to sack the city. With trembling fingers he reached into his pocket, searching for skyglass to help him calm his nerves. He pulled out a handful of baubles that immediately slipped from his fingers, falling into the mud. He plunged after them desperately, but came up with nothing. Across the street, the cry of a child caught his attention. He looked up to see a little girl, probably no more than 4 or 5, screaming into the air. Demir pushed himself to his feet and struggled out of the ditch. If he could not save the many, he would save the one. The sound of galloping hooves filled his ears, and his path was suddenly blocked by several dozen of his dragoons. He'd never been so close to them before, and the thunder of their passing would have made him piss his pants if he hadn't already done it in the ditch. He searched his pocket for godglass, remembered that he'd dropped it all, and then gathered his courage. The dragoons were soon gone, and he took several more steps before his eyes fell on the spot where the child had been. The child had been trampled. Her little body was silent and still, broken and bloody. He staggered toward her, tearing off his victor's cloak and using it to scoop her up, before sprinting to the other side of the road just ahead of another group of dragoons. He clutched the body to his chest, every fiber of him shaking, and dropped onto the front step of an abandoned shop. The nightmare had only just begun. By the time his staff found him, Demir had not moved. He had not slept or eaten or had a coherent thought in more than 12 hours. He sat on the step, cradling the corpse of the child in his victor's cloak, having spent a night watching every atrocity that a victorious army could inflict upon a city. His head lay against the cool stone of the shop's threshold, his eyes burning from the acrid smoke of 100 fires, his tongue parched and his wrist swollen. It was Adrian who discovered him and called for the others. The breacher had discarded his armor, wearing an officer's uniform stitched with the ram's horns that gave him his moniker. He came and knelt before Demir, examining his face. Demir flinched away from that purple god-glass eye. "Sir, are you all right?" Demir could not find the words to reply. He felt hollow, stripped. He knew that his legs still worked. The very idea of standing felt impossible. He licked his cracked lips, tried to summon words, and failed. He felt tears in his eyes and tried to look away, to hide them from the breacher. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he finally managed. "I didn't give those orders." "I know, sir," Adrian replied gently. "Communication went awry. We'll find out what happened, I promise." Slowly, the rest of Demir's staff gathered behind Adrian, staring down at Demir. In the place of those victorious grins of yesterday were looks of horror and disgust. Caprick came close enough to pry into what Demir had wrapped in his cloak, only to stumble away and retch in the ditch. Adrian's one eye darted toward the dead child, but he did not flinch from it. Demir could feel the stares of his staff. He could see the calculation in their eyes, each one wondering how this development would affect their career or their guild family. He could see that each of them was trying to figure out how to detach their name from this disaster. It was one thing to punish a rebelling city with defeat and decimation. It was another entirely to put it to the torch. Demir tried to think. He attempted to gather all his faculties, to calculate the possibilities of the future. He had given his word before more than a dozen people that Holican was under his protection, and then his army had sacked it. They'd murdered and burned and plundered on his apparent orders. He needed to start an investigation to pin this disaster on someone else, either real or invented. "Whitglass," he croaked. Caprick returned to his side, pressing a piece into his hand. Demir fixed it to a piercing, trying to think. His mind was blank, and the whitglass caused a sharp pain behind his eyes until he removed it and gave it back. He could no longer calculate. The future was dark and silent. His mind had broken. "Maria Forel?" he asked, raising his head to look for the mayor. "She is safe," Adrian assured him. "Your uncle arrived in the middle of the night, and I left her with our battalion. No one will harm her." Demir's gaze went to the black column of smoke that rose above them. "I wish she were not safe. I wish she could not see what I have done." "You didn't do this," Adrian said firmly. "It was an accident, a crossing of orders." Demir looked across the faces of his staff. They all avoided his gaze. Not from fear this time, but from shame. He had not done this, certainly, but it was his responsibility. Slowly, every muscle hurting, Demir managed to climb to his feet without dropping the body of the child. He found the door to the shop open, and the inside ransacked, though he had no memory of soldiers forcing themselves past him. He deposited the body, still wrapped in his victory cloak, on the shop counter. He touched the child's hair briefly, searching for a prayer from his childhood, wishing he believed in a god to pray to. He tried to gather his thoughts. How could he face another person after this? How could he return to his guild family, or his lovers, or the people of his province? How could he ever look another soul in the eye? He returned to the front step. For the first time in years, he felt his youth, helpless, inexperienced, and wondering when a real adult would come along and fix all this. Adrian produced a milk glass bauble and pressed it into Demir's hand. The god glass was not as high quality as his own, but the sorcerer's effect was immediate. The ache began to bleed from his bones. "We should see to that wrist," Adrian said. "It looks like it might be broken." Even with Adrian's milk glass, Demir's wrist hurt so bad that he no longer felt it. Like his soul, it was numb. "Who is my second in command?" No one answered. He peered at the faces of his staff. "I don't even know." A mad-sounding laugh slipped through his lips. "In my arrogance, I never thought I'd need them. Well, whoever they are, congratulate them on their promotion." "Sir?" Adrian asked. "I resign." "You can't resign," someone said. "This is your moment of triumph." Demir looked for Capric, hoping for an ounce of reassurance. His friend was staring, slap-jawed, at the dozens of dead in the street, all civilians. A triumph. He might still be able to salvage this. His mother, political genius that she was, would certainly try. But if he marched back into Asa at the front of a triumphal parade after this, he would never be able to live with himself. He avoided Adrian's gaze. "Apologize to Maria Forel for me. Tell my uncle that I'm sorry for not finishing the campaign. Capric, write up my resignation. Forge my signature." His mother would be disappointed. "So promising," she would say. "Such a fool. We could have fixed this." Demir stumbled off the step, regained his balance, and began to walk. "Tell them not to come looking for me," he said over his shoulder. "The Lightning Prince is dead." Chapter 1. 9 years after the sack of Holican. Demir Grappo stood in the back row of an amphitheater, a small cudgeling arena in the provincial city of Ereptia. Even by provincial standards, Ereptia was a backwater, a little city in the heart of wine-making country with less than 10,000 people, most of them employed as laborers on the vast vineyards owned by distant, wealthy Ossan guild families. The only arena in Ereptia sat only a few hundred people, and just a third of the seats were full for an afternoon exhibition match. Cudgeling was the national sport of the empire, bigger and more popular than horse racing, cockfighting, hunting, and boxing combined. The two contestants in the arena wore powerful forged glass earrings to make them stronger and faster, and then beat the shit out of each other with weighted sticks until one of them forfeited, or died. It was a visceral sport, and Demir felt that it defined the entire Ossan experience wonderfully. The way the contestants broke their bodies for the chance at glory, while everyone else cheered them on. Someday, he would write a philosophical treatise on the subject. He clutched a bookie's receipt in one hand, watching the two fighters go back and forth across the arena as the sparse crowd shouted curses and encouragements. The woman was named Sletina. She had the milk-white complexion of a Pernian with short blonde hair, and was 6 feet of solid muscle. The man's name was Overin, and he was shorter but faster, with a bald head, bushy black beard, and the light olive skin of an eastern provincial. They were well matched, brawn versus speed, and the crowd was absolutely loving it as the strikes fell. Skin cracked, and blood spattered the sandy floor of the arena. Demir himself was paying close attention to how they fought, rather than who was actually winning. It needed to be a good match, with little doubt that the two fighters wanted nothing more than to kill each other. By the time Overin fell to the ground beneath Sletina's cudgel, weakly raising a hand to forfeit before she could administer the final blow, Demir knew that everyone had bought it. Neither the judges, the audience, nor the bookkeepers had any idea that the pair were well paid for the inevitable conclusion. Demir loitered until the last of the audience trickled out of the arena, and the cudgelists themselves had long since been given cuir-glass and escorted away. He watched and listened, making sure that no one so much as suspected that the fight was fixed. When he was certain that their performance had been accepted, he sauntered down the steps, out the front of the arena, and across the street, where a slummy little cantina held one of Ereptia's many bookies. Demir slid onto a stool at the bar, set down his betting receipt, and then gave it a tap with one finger. "I need a new piece of sky-glass," Demir said, adjusting the gloves that hid his dual silk sigils. The bartender and bookie was a middle-aged man named Morlius. He had a harried look in his eyes, but moved slowly as he rinsed out mugs in a barrel of water underneath the bar. Demir wouldn't normally order God Bless at a bar, but this far out in the provinces it was the only place a stranger could get their hands on a luxury commodity. Morlius barely glanced at him. "Can't get sky glass at all right now," he said. "Not even the cheap stuff?" "Not even the cheap stuff. No idea why. Supply just isn't coming in from Ossa, and what little I could get last month was bought up by the vineyard managers." Shit. The calming sorcery of sky glass wasn't going to save Demir's life, but it would certainly make it easier. His last piece had run out of resonance 3 nights ago, and he'd had a hard time sleeping without it since Holican. He rubbed at his temples. "Days glass?" Morlius shook his head. "Fine. Give me half a pint of Eruptia's best and put it on this tab." He tapped the bookie's receipt once more. "You won, huh?" Morlius asked, gazing at him sullenly. "Sure did." Demir gave him his most charming smile. "Lucky afternoon." He pushed the receipt across the bar. "Drink?" Morlius did not reach for a wine glass. "You won yesterday, too. And the day before that." "And I lost the 3 days prior," Demir replied, keeping that smile fixed on his face. "Good luck follows bad, I suppose." "I don't think there's any luck in it." Demir let his smile fade into a faux confusion, cursing himself silently. He was very careful about losing almost as much as he'd won. Had he made a mistake? Or was Morlius tipped off? "I'm not sure what you're implying," Demir said, huffing loudly. Morlius did not have a pleasant reputation. Rumor had it he was in the business of drugging cudgelists before fights to get the result he wanted. He didn't do it often, not often enough to attract official attention, but the reputation was well-earned enough that cudgelists in the know avoided his cantina. Demir didn't begrudge the foul play. That would be hypocritical, after all. He did begrudge the treatment of the cudgelists. His fighters always got a cut. That was the rule. One of Morlius's goons appeared from the cellar carrying a new wine cask. Morlius not so subtly jerked his head at Demir. The goon set down the cask and closed the cantina door, then moved to stand behind Demir. Morlius reached under the bar and produced a cudgel of his own. "Heard a story about a man of your description over in Wallach. Got caught fixing fights and then skipped town before they could string him up. Ripped off my cousin for thousands." Demir sighed and glanced over his shoulder. The goon behind him was well over 6 feet tall, thick and powerful, with the oft-broken fingers and battered face of a retired cudgelist. The goon drew a long knife from his belt. "You're pulling a knife on a patron because of a vague description of a grifter from 3 towns over?" Demir scoffed. He wasn't quite ready to move on from Eruptia yet. Slatina, other than being a talented cudgelist and quite a good actress, had invited him to meet her parents next weekend. Demir loved meeting people's parents. It was like looking into the future to see what they'd be like in 30 years. "Don't be dumb, Morlius. It's not even on a big bet. If you can't pay out today, I'll take it against my future tab." If Morlius were smart, he would pleasantly drug Demir, rob him blind, and leave him in an alley on the other side of town. But Morlius was not smart. He didn't know when to rein in his greed. Demir turned on his stool so that one shoulder was pointed at Morlius and the bar, and the other at the goon. He glanced over the goon's shoulder, out a window into the street, where he saw something that hadn't been there before. A very nice carriage with sky blue curtains, 6 bodyguards on the running boards, and the Silic sigil of the Vorsian family etched on the door. Demir's thoughts were instantly knocked awry. What was a Vorsian doing way out here in the provinces? Morlius suddenly lurched forward, grabbing Demir's wrist and raising his cudgel. "I think you match the description too well." Demir's heart fell. No getting that payout, then. Or meeting Slatina for dinner tonight. He would have to move on to the next town, interrupting his life, and abandoning his friends and lovers like he'd done dozens of times over the last 9 years. The very thought of it made him tired, but it also made him mad. He cast his mental net outward, using his glass dancer's sorcery to make note of every windowpane and wine bottle in the cantina. "Let go of my hand," Demir said flatly. "Or," Morlius grinned at him. Demir applied a small amount of sorcerer's pressure. A wine bottle behind Morlius shattered, causing him to jump. A second shattered, then a third. Morlius whirled toward the rack of wine bottles, yelling wordlessly, reaching toward the bottles without touching them. Demir shattered 2 more before slowly and deliberately removing his left glove and laying his hand flat on the bar. When Morlius turned back toward him, the glass dancer's sigil was on full display. Morlius's eyes widened, filling with that familiar look of terror that had gazed back at Demir from so many sets of eyes since he got his tattoo at the age of 18. It made his stomach twist in knots, but he kept that from his own expression. Morlius was not a friend. Morlius had just unwittingly destroyed Demir's life in Eruptia, and he could damn well rot in his fear. I'm, Morlius stuttered. Demir leaned against the bar, channeling his disgust. Take your time, he said. The goon behind him had fled back into the cellar, slamming the thick wooden door behind him. Smart man. I have all day. Demir burst another wine bottle, enjoying the way Morlius flinched. Demir knew that Morlius would do nothing. Who would with a glass dancer right in front of him? If he so desired, Demir could get away with anything at this moment. Demir drew in a deep, ragged breath. He was being petulant now. He'd made his point, but it still took a force of will to keep himself from destroying every piece of glass at the bar and then throwing it all into Morlius's face. That wasn't who he was. Demir touched the bookie's receipt with one finger and pushed it toward Morlius again. The bookie stared at it for several moments before realization dawned in his eyes. He pulled the purse from his belt and set it on the bar. Take it, please, he was begging now. What a damned reversal. I'm not robbing you, Demir said softly. I'm just a customer getting a payout. Somehow this seemed even more painful for the bookie. His hands trembled fiercely as he opened the purse and began to count out heavy imperial coins. He scattered the stack twice with those trembling hands, checking the receipt 3 times before nodding at Demir. Most of the glass dancers Demir had ever met lived up to their reputations in some way or another. They enjoyed using the threat of their power to lord over others. They stole and they threatened and they seduced without thought of consequence. Such displays had never brought Demir pleasure. Occasional satisfaction, like putting Morlius in his place? Sure, but never pleasure. He swept the coins into his hand and deposited them in his pocket. I'll have you know that I left Wallach on very good terms. All the judges and fighters got rich with my fixed fights. The only person who didn't like me was the bookie stupid enough to make bets with his client's money. I'm guessing he's your cousin. Be smarter than your cousin Morlius. I left him alive, but I also left him very poor. Right. If you say one word about this, or I find out you've drugged any of my fighters. Demir nodded at the shelf of destroyed wine bottles. I'll actually do something with all that glass. He slapped the bar. Have a good day, Morlius. Demir turned away before his frustration could truly start to show. Another lost life, another town he had to leave, before anyone figured out who he really was. Another crack in his identity's facade, held back by nothing more than a threat. Should he say goodbye to Slatina? She would, rightfully, want an explanation. She didn't even know his real name. Best to just disappear. He was suddenly exhausted by it all, wishing he had some semblance of normalcy in his life. He'd forgotten all about the Vorsian carriage out front, so it came as quite a shock when he opened the door to the bar and found a familiar face staring back at him. It had been 9 years since Demir had last seen Capric Vorsian. Capric was thinner, more statesmanlike, with features that had grown almost hawkish as he crept into his 30s. He was wearing a very expensive jacket and tunic, clutching a black cane with one hand. A pair of bodyguards stood in the street behind him. Demir? He asked in surprise. Demir peered hard at Capric for several moments, shook his head in confusion, then peered again. Sure enough, this was Capric Vorsian in the flesh. Glassdam, Capric? What the piss are you doing here? Looking for you. Are you okay? You look miserable. Did you already hear the news? Demir felt his blood run cold. He'd gone to great lengths to make himself hard to find. If Caprick was here with bad news, it must be very bad. He offered his hand, which Caprick shook. I haven't. What brings you out to my corner of the provinces? You have a corner? Talking with Breen, and you haven't lived in the same spot for more than 6 months since you fled Holican. Demir felt his eye twitch at the mention of Holican, and Caprick immediately hurried on. Forgive me, it sounds like you've been moving around a lot. I have, Demir confirmed. Stay too long in one place and people start to wonder why you wear gloves all the time. What's Breenan doing babbling about all my movements? Did Mother send you out here to try to fetch me back? Caprick looked around and said, Can we speak in private? My carriage is just outside. Under normal circumstances, Demir would refuse. Speaking in private carriage stamped with the Guild family civic sigil would bring up a lot of questions for Demir's friends in this little provincial town. But that run-in with Marlius just now had already ended Demir's stint. Besides, it was best to find out the bad news quickly. Lead on. He followed Caprick out to the carriage. Local kids were running around it, alternatively shouting barbs at and begging from the bodyguards. The bodyguards shooed them off as Demir and Caprick approached, and they were soon inside, where Caprick immediately pulled out a bottle of sherry and poured them each a glass on a fold-down side table. Demir was studying his old friend closely now, trying to get a read on this entire visit. He took a sip, set the glass back on the side table, and said, What's going on, Caprick? How did you find me, and what are you here for? Caprick gulped his glass, poured himself a second, and sipped half of it before answering. I'm sorry, Demir. For? Your mother is dead. Demir felt the blood drain from his face. Is this a joke? I wish it was. Breenan told me where to find you, and I rushed out here at speed to reach you before you had to read it in the newspapers. Demir examined Caprick's tired, earnest expression for several moments to see the truth of things, then opened the door and vomited out his breakfast on the cobbles. He felt a gentle hand on his back while he spat out bile, then wiped his mouth on an offered handkerchief. A million thoughts flashed through his mind. Regrets, plans, recriminations. He might have seen his mother only a few times in the last decade, but she'd always been a reassuring candle burning in a distant window. Now that she'd been snuffed out, he cursed himself for not visiting more, and for failing to live up to her expectations for a child prodigy. He searched his pockets for skyglass before remembering that he didn't have any left. When he next looked up, Caprick was holding out a light blue piece for him. Demir took it gratefully and threaded the hooked end through one of his piercings. His racing heart and mind immediately began to slow, giving him time to take a deep breath and compose himself. What happened? He asked. It's unpleasant, Caprick warned. Death always is, Demir replied, steeling himself. She was beaten to death on the steps of the assembly. Demir let out an involuntary sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. Adriana Grappo was a reformer, one of the few assembly members who dedicated their lives to helping the masses, rather than enriching themselves. Reformers in Assa had a long and glorious tradition of dying publicly, killed by their peers, for pushing societal reforms too strongly. Who did it? Caprick shook his head. We don't know yet. There were 6 masked figures that descended on her quickly, finished the job, and fled in all directions, before guards could be called. And before you reply, I know what you're thinking. She wasn't killed because of her reforms. Sure, her proposed taxes annoyed the elites, but everyone loved your mother. The assembly is furious, and I will be shocked if they haven't caught the culprits by the time I return. Demir pulled himself out of a spiral of suspicions and tried to focus on the calming hum of the skyglass in his ear. Caprick was right. Adriana had always walked a cool line between radical reformer and harmless politician. She always knew when to push and when to back off. So it wasn't her fellow assemblyman? I can't imagine. Demir leaned his head against the wall of the carriage. Who did it, then? What enemies had she made in the years that Demir had been gone? An investigation has been launched? A very serious one. Has Uncle Thaddeus been told? I'm not sure. The Assembly is covering up the murder until they have more information. Adriana was very popular with the common people. Announcing her death before they have a solid lead could result in riots. Covering up a public murder might sound ridiculous to some people, but the Assembly was very good at that sort of thing. They had lots of practice. Smart, Demir agreed. Baby Montego should also be informed. Caprick paled. Most people did when Montego was mentioned. As the cudgeling champion of the world, he is one of the few normal people who could command the same sort of fear as a glass dancer. He was also Demir's best friend and adopted brother. I have sent word already, Caprick promised, but last I heard he was on his yacht in the Glass Isles. It might be months before he returns. Demir sucked his teeth loudly, using the calming sorcery of the skyglass to shove aside his personal feelings and tick through the list of things he needed to do now that he was the head of the small Grappo guild family. As if anticipating his thoughts, Caprick said softly, I have brought with me an offer from my father. Demir lifted an eyebrow. Yes? He would take the Grappo on as a client guild family. You'd have the protection of our patronage. We'd pay off any debts Adriana might have had, take care of the hotel, look after your own clients. You won't even have to return home if you don't want. He trailed off, looking as if he might have shown his hand too early. Demir ignored the impropriety. This was Asa, after all. Everything was business, even the death of a family member. It was a generous offer. The Vorsian were one of the most powerful guild families in Asa. Slipping underneath their protection could benefit Demir greatly. But it would also end the Grappo guild family and severely curtail Demir's freedom. Patronage came with stipulations and responsibilities. He shook his head. Thank you. No. I need to return home and put Mother's affairs in order before I even consider anything like that. The offer is there. Tell Father Vorsian I'm most grateful. Of course. Are you returning to Asa immediately? Demir examined Caprick carefully, trying to weigh any hidden meaning in the question. The Grappo might be a tiny guild family, but Adriana Grappo had been a colossus of Austen politics. The return of her failed prodigy's son might cause havoc in various corners of the capital. Did Caprick, or the Vorsian family at large, have a stake in Demir's possible return? He swallowed a bit of bile and removed the skyglass from his ear, bathing in the return of his anger and uncertainty. It helped him feel human. What talk is there of Demir Grappo? He asked. Caprick somehow looked more uncomfortable than before. Am I hated? Demir pressed. Forgotten, Caprick said slowly. Adriana did a wonderful job of cleaning up after Holican. It was all but covered up. Demir Grappo and the Lightning Prince are but distant memories, and no one talks about Holican at all. Demir chewed on this information. He removed his right glove and rubbed at the Silic sigil of the Grappo guild family. With his mother dead and his uncle abdicating responsibility in favor of a life in the military, Demir was the last full-blooded Grappo left. Could a failed politician without progeny of his own possibly hope to keep the line afloat? That's about the best I could have hoped for. Really? For a few years there, you were the greatest politician in the Empire. You were everything. A guild family heir, a general, a politician, a glass dancer, all that prestige, all that work. Lost. I'm not re-entering politics, Demir told him. Then why return at all? Why not become a client to the Vorsian? Demir considered this for a few moments before deciding not to answer. He patted Caprick's arm. Thank you for coming all the way out here to tell me. That is a kindness I will repay. It'll take me a couple of days to put my affairs in order. I'll see you at my hotel. In a week? Of course. Demir stepped out of the carriage and off to one side, ignoring the curious stares from the townsfolk and the open hands of the street children crowding around him. Caprick gave him a wave from the carriage window, and then it pulled away and trundled down the street. He reached into his pocket, searching out a piece of whip-glass. It was a small hoop, no bigger than the end of his finger, with a hook on one end. Sorcery still had a small effect when clutched in the fingers, not nearly as much when worn in the ear or held between the teeth, but enough to speed his thoughts. It had, he realized, been a gift from his mother. They had last spoken 3 months ago, when she'd tracked him down in one of the southern provinces and begged him to return to Asa and restart his career. If he had done as she asked, would she still be alive? It was a question that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. So, why return at all? Why not take Caprick's offer and become a client to the Foreseeing? 100 different answers swirled around in his head. His mother's death changed things, and the responsibilities he'd avoided for 9 years were suddenly multiplied tenfold by virtue of inheritance. Because, Demir said softly to himself, she deserved better than to die like that. I wasn't there to protect her, so I can at least protect her legacy and destroy the people who did this. That brings us to the end of Chapter 2 of In the Shadow of Lightning by Brian McClellan. Unfortunately, that's all I have time to read for you today and all I have permission to read. So you have seen Adrian, he is later a viewpoint character. Additionally, you have not yet met Kizzy or Thessa, who are also viewpoint characters in this book. Yes, it has 4 viewpoint characters. It is a full 560 pages or so long and is really the beginning of a true epic fantasy series. I have read this book. I absolutely loved it. It's got a cover quote from some dude named Brandon Sanderson that you might have heard of. Just everything about this book is lined up to be awesome. I really hope you've enjoyed the preview that I was able to give you today, and I hope that if you pick up this book, Book 1 of the Class Immortals, that you really enjoy it too. Thank you for joining me today for the reading from In the Shadow of Lightning. I will be back, I'm not sure when, with another video, probably a review of this book, if I can finish a full reread in time, and I will see you all later. Until then, happy reading.